ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great honor and pleasure to welcome you all at the new Library of Alexandria, a place that is dedicated to capture the spirit of openness and scholarship of the old Library of Alexandria. It is much more than a library. It's a place of grandeur that promotes new ideas, openness, tolerance, dialogue, learning, and understanding. We are all gathered here today at this unique place to witness the closing conference of the Alexandria Dialogues titled Images of a Prosperous Egypt in 2050. Our conference is held under the auspices of Her Excellency Professor Hala Said, Minister of Planning, Monitoring, and Administrative Reform, and in partnership with the United Nations Resident Coordinator, Mr. Richard Dictus, and his office. As we gather here today, we have to look back upon the exciting and eye-opening journey that we have embarked upon more than 1 year ago. A journey that started with one question, that is, what would Egypt look like in 2050? Many of you have been our partners in this journey, and throughout such journey, we went on asking so many questions about Egypt, building several scenarios about its future, putting down all expertise and knowledge to try to draw images of a prosperous Egypt. Images that hold youth at their heart. Images that are capable of conquering all hurdles and tearing down all obstacles. Images that support development, which meets the needs of the present without compromising the future. It has now become so clear that sustainable development is a complex process that requires integrating economic, social, cultural, political, and ecological elements. It also requires the commitment of all stakeholders towards its achievement. Through the years, the Library of Alexandria has stayed true to the cause of sustainability and has been committed to steer up serious dialogues, actions, awareness, studies, and examinations about almost all of its components. During today and tomorrow, I invite you, our esteemed guests, to examine the outcomes of our dialogues, support them as well as critique them, to share with us your vision for the future as well as your knowledge and expertise with our youth, in a setting that we are certain that owing to your participation will turn out to be the most enlightening and intriguing. I also ask our youth and to prominently engage in our discussions to make use of this unique setting to expand their horizon. Finally, I would like to share with you a message from the BA Director, His Excellency Professor Mustapha Al-Fiqi. Professor Al-Fiqi is saddened by the fact that he won't be able to join you today due to unforeseen pressing commitment that he had to attend to in Cairo. However, he is looking forward to welcoming you all in person tomorrow and to deliver his closing speech. Thank you all. And now we will be playing a glimpse of our exciting journey over the past year. This journey and success wouldn't have been possible without your valuable contribution as well as your dedication and commitment to the process. So let's watch it together. And now I invite to the podium our partner in this endeavor, the UN Resident Coordinator to Egypt, Mr. Richard Dictus. Both Mr. Dictus and his office have been great partners and supporters to the BEA, and I must seize this opportunity to thank them for this effective and successful partnership that they have invested a lot in to ensure its growth, development, and sustainability. Before becoming the UN Resident Coordinator to Egypt, he has served as the Executive Coordinator of the United Nations Volunteers Program. He joined the United Nations in South Yemen in 1987. He subsequently served in different UNDP capacities in Sudan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan in environmental management, rural development, microfinance, human rights, and disaster management. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Dictus.
Thank you, Dr. Marwa. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, friends, I am very pleased at this beginning to see so many of the faces of people who were engaged in the dialogues over the last months, last year, as Dr. Marwa correctly pointed out. I think it is important that there is indeed a continuity of discussion, but I think more importantly, the fact that many of you have actually come back for this closing conference indicates that we did hit a rather important note by looking at the opportunity of the future of Egypt, the opportunity by 2050. I can provide you the assurances that until the very last minute we were in contact with Dr. Hala Saeed and her team concerning her participation, and it is indeed something that happened at the last moment where they could not come. But we've been asked to make sure that we submit a full report on the proceedings and the discussion so that it can proceed into the debate and the discussion of what comes next, how do we manage the future. Allow me to start off by drawing two different scenarios for Egypt at the end of this century. The first scenario. In the year 2100, Egypt would have had a population of 180 million inhabitants and a gross domestic product of 3 times the size current Germany. It scores high in all areas of human development, providing high quality education and universal healthcare for all. Whether it is in Upper Egypt, the Western Oasis, the Nile Delta, or the Sinai, all people in Egypt are able to live a comfortable and abundant life with sufficient water and energy resources. The Egyptians have successfully adjusted to the effects of climate change and leveraged it to their advantage while maintaining their identity, having once more proven their unique capability to adapt to the flow of the Nile. They feel connected to their family and friends, to others in their country, and to others around the world. The country is established and recognized as a global player. Driven by the latest technologies, it is the home to an Arab-African Silicon Valley. Setting up a new business online will take you 2 hours. Western European states are trying to compete and make attractive job offers to the top-notch graduates of engineering and medicine. But very few will want to take the jobs because they would like to live in this highly developed and thriving country. Or another scenario. In the year 2100, Egypt has a population of 330 million people, living on a fraction of the land that has remained inhabitable. The effects of climate change, like desertification, floods, sea level rise, and unpredictable weather, have made the living conditions in many areas of the country extremely difficult. Consequentially, there is a high level of exclusion, there is tension in an irrational society and conflicts over water and resources. The country's agriculture sector can only feed a small fraction of the population, so most of the country's food needs to be imported. Yet the country is inward-looking, struggling with a global economy it can barely access, and developing new technological dependencies as it continues to lag further and further behind. These are two complete different extremes that I've just outlined to you. And there's obviously a continuum of issues that basically connects them. 180 million versus 330 million. But what is very important is that we understand that the final outcome of the scenario by 2100 will be shaped by unexpected developments. At this moment, we do not know what artificial intelligence will mean, how robotics and the digital economy are going to impact on our life. But the same thing, while we know that climate change is happening, we do not know necessarily the dimensions, nor do we know exactly the human impact. The Alexandria dialogues examined and looked at both opportunity and possibility for Egypt by 2050. The principle was not to constrain our imagination and not to get stuck in negative scenario building. It is always very easy to imagine the worst, yet we set out to imagine the best, a prosperous and sustainable life for all people living in Egypt. This thinking is represented in the chairman's summary that will be circulated today. This exercise has been the art of the possible. I'm not going to go into details about the summary. The last time that I did this at the Ministry of Planning, I ended up speaking for 45 minutes, and I don't think that that would be the right thing to do. But it is important to mention to you that the summary has been validated with well over 60 participants. And while respecting the strict rules of non-attribution that we worked with, by and large, they assured us that the summary is reflective of the discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, what I personally concluded from the dialogues is that the scenario of Egypt in the year 2050 will be determined by three main challenges. The first challenge I would call the digital transformation. Egypt will need to integrate new technological developments into society, allowing them to shape the way in which society evolves. It will impact on all aspects of life, the way that we communicate, the way that we work, the way that we move, the way that we transport ourselves, the way that we learn, the houses that we live in, and the food that we eat. Automation, artificial intelligence, robotics, ICT, and the Internet of Things are not only to be adopted, but they are to be managed and leveraged in their entirety by Egypt, but without creating new vulnerabilities. Inasmuch as digital transformation will create new jobs, the concern is, what happens to the people who held the old jobs? Will they now be left behind? And inasmuch as we can imagine new, modern and smart cities, what will happen to the rural areas? And will all Egyptians have access to these smart new cities? And finally, will a digital transformation allow the country to preserve its cultural identity and at the same time build up a Silicon Valley for the Arab states and possibly the African continent? The second transformation is the economic transformation. A significant transformation in the economy would foresee a shift from 70% of the labor force engaged in informal labor to 70% in formal labor, with decent jobs, higher wages, social protection, rights and contracts. Underlying this transformation are topics like the green and circular economy that connects opportunities in the cities to the rural areas and that ensures equitable outcomes of growth, but also an energy transition that will allow Egypt to generate an abundance of cheap electricity for export, but also solar energy at such low cost that desalination becomes feasible to a national scale, breaking the binding constraint of water on economic expansion. Egypt also has the potential of becoming a leading exporter of manufactured goods to Africa, based again on cheap energy, its geographical location, and the access to markets via the Nile River. Climate-smart agriculture with desalinated water and solar power can give Egypt a major comparative advantage as an exporter of fruit and vegetables. These changes combined would turn Egypt into a competitive economy with the potential of becoming a global major player. Demographic transformation. Egypt is in a unique position to be able to reap several demographic dividends. In a global scenario in which many of today's leading economies will be facing labor shortages in mid-century, this will completely reposition the current global debate on labor migration and most likely will cause shifts in the global foreign direct investment patterns that could benefit the Egyptian economy. In addition to that, by sheer force of numbers, Egypt's increasing population will drive growth, and the overall dependency rates will decrease. In other words, a situation will occur where the employed population and the people dependent on their productivity and income will be at the very least in balance. But whether population growth can be balanced and will stay within the limits of its resources and expansion is still a question. This leads one to conclude that economic growth can indeed solve many of Egypt's poverty and social problems, providing that population does not outstrip economic gains. These three transformations will require new approaches in public administration. A public administration that embraces, for instance, artificial intelligence to ensure that it keeps step with the private sector-driven economic expansion. It also will be a public administration that will have to deal with more people and more complexity. Complexity that is determined by factors within and outside of the country. Let's take the complexity of the education system, where the basic challenge of building more schools and hiring more teachers for a continuously growing young population will need to be balanced with developing science and technology, research and development, and academic excellence for Egypt to be competitive and self-reliant in a volatile international market for technology, knowledge, skills, and people. Public stewardship for these kind of changes, the efficiency and effectiveness of expenditure associated with fiscal space and fiscal responsibility will to a large extent determine both the pace and the direction of challenge. To quote somebody without quoting somebody, because we were not going to do that, although some of you have probably all heard back some of your statements, the future of Egypt is too important to be let up completely to imperfect markets and imperfect global trade regimes. Ladies and gentlemen, the Alexandria Dialogues offered a global platform for exploring scenarios and deliberations on the future of Egypt using the latest foresight techniques developed by global corporations and academia. As we take in the trends that we signaled, it also sets an agenda for the work that still needs to be done, because there were a number of things that we did not yet do. We look mainly at human impacts and issues based on the expertise that was in the room, and we consistently had an awful lot of expertise in the room. But there are other processes in which foresight is more strongly informed by data and trend analysis to develop scenarios with firmer footings. These approaches tend to be less creative than the path that we followed. They are typically caught up in the tyranny of data, in which the future can only be imagined on the basis of today's statistics, today's trends, and today's global averages, not recognizing that the future most likely will be shaped by the unexpected or by factors that we cannot yet fully measure or completely understand. We also did not go into detail in the evolving scenarios in numeric terms. We did not set targets and benchmarks. That means that the process of backcasting, setting a target and then figuring out what needs to be done, has not yet been done with any serious intent. Over the next 2 days, I hope that many of these topics, for instance, the relationship between trend analysis, forecasting, foresight, and backcasting, will be discussed. We do not just want to debrief on the process we followed and the realizations that we had, but we are also bringing together a force field with international experience to examine how forecasting and foresight can be used as part and parcel of Egypt's planning and decision-making culture. And in this respect, we are specifically looking at the University of Denver, the government of Malaysia, and various United Nations agencies to share their experience. As the series comes to an end, new tasks arise. If we want the best case scenario to materialize, what decisions do we have to make today? What are the paths that lead us towards the best possible solutions? And how can these solutions best be data-informed and evidence-based? What is feasible? What is possible? And how can the dialogue be turned into an exercise of foresight and data? Ladies and gentlemen, it would be remiss of me not to recognize the impact that working with the Bibliotheca Alexandria has had on the process. Aside from Dr. Mustapha Al-Fayhi's personal leadership and his immense wealth in both knowledge and context, coupled with his personal generosity of spirit to share this, we owe a debt of gratitude to his team of top-notch professionals who stewarded us through the process and who co-facilitated the sessions with us. We not only had good working relationships, but also a very effective knowledge transfer that has enabled the Bibliotheca to now have foresight as one of its competencies. A modern capability that the institution that prides itself on the venue of a state-of-art academic thinking and the examination of new ideas can indeed utilize. I would like to thank you for your kind attention, and I wish us all excellent deliberations and an excellent conference so that we can take foresight thinking to the next stage. Thank you very much.
And now I'm asking Mr. Richard Dictus, the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Egypt, to present the summary of the Alexandria Dialogues Chairperson's report. Through his talk, he'll be taking us step by step through our model with a special emphasis on the philosophy behind it, its methodology, and finally its major outcomes. I would like also to invite to the stage Professor Ibrahim Awad, who has been a valuable and enthusiastic participant in many of our dialogues, having been kind enough to accept our invitation to be part of this session, where he will be commenting on the report, its outcome, as well as sharing his insights and views about its methodology. Professor Awad is at present Professor of Practice in Global Affairs and Director of the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies, School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo. He worked for the League of Arab States, the United Nations, and the International Labour Organization, holding positions of Secretary of the Commission, UN and Social Commission for Western Asia, Director of the ILO Sub-Regional Office for North Africa, and Director ILO International Migration Program. Please join me in welcoming both Mr. Dictus and Professor Awad.
Let me start off by talking about Egypt in 1960. Now, some of you will have already heard me talk about this before, but in 1960, Egypt had 27 million people and an economy of about $2.7 billion. Now the question is, would anybody in the 1960s have been able to foresee or forecast Egypt today? 100 million people, population 4 times the size, and an economy of $300 billion. That is a quantum leap that we are talking about. And the question then also would be, is there anywhere in the trend analysis of the between 1900 and 1960 that would have allowed us to predict what these things would be doing to us? Would anybody on the basis of that time would have been able to say in 2019 people will have personal communication and data devices that are capable of complex calculations and they carry them in their pocket? I think anybody would have been asked whether they've been drinking the same Kool-Aid as Jules Verne. That was how far that was away. Yet the digital revolution that already has taken place, with this as an evidence that you all carry with you, essentially shows you that the future is not necessarily determined by the past trends, that actually history does not repeat itself, and that actually we are looking consistently at new ways of trying to understand what may happen in the future with the unexpected. Now we have created probably or arguably at this moment some unexpected things ourselves, and I would point at climate change, but also at the way in which we utilize the natural resources of the world. Never before has the earth been inhabited by this many people, Never before have we been challenged to grow enough food for everybody in the way that we're doing now. And never before have we been utilizing the Earth's resources to the extent that we have done now. And if you think that with all the discussion on carbon footprint and greenhouse gases, the utilization of fossil fuels is going down, you are sadly mistaken. Over the next 10 years, the utilization of fossil fuels is going to increase by a further 8% when new gas and oil fields are getting into production. So we actually are in a situation where we do not know where that leads us. That over-exploitation of natural resources and the way that that will go, the large number of people that we've put on our earth, the realization that there's only so much water, the realization that there's only so much land, how will we solve the problem of that conundrum? Now, there are many ways of looking at the future. Now, hopefully this will work. Okay, let me try that again. So this is the laser pointer. Yes, there we go. The first way that we look at it, let me see if this is right, that's one, is the crystal ball. So it's a very simple technique. You have somebody who sits in a dark room, normally with a few candles, who has a crystal ball and who looks in the crystal ball and tells you that he or she knows exactly what the future will bring. This has a very limited validity, although one has to recognize that even a broken clock will every 2 times a day indicate the right time. So crystal balls do sometimes get it right, but it is not a very reliable method. Second one, method, hang on, is prediction. And here you actually see a picture of an octopus who was basically brought out during the last European Football Championship to predict that Spain was going to win from the Netherlands. And the octopus, unfortunately, was right. Prediction is something that is very difficult to figure out because quite often you actually will not rely on an octopus, but you will rely on somebody who actually knows, an expert, somebody who has understood. But quite often it is one person's opinion. It's not necessarily very reflective. It's not something that has taken a great time to think about. And then the third variety is actually forecasting. And this is Prince Charles forecasting the weather in the UK, and I thought that that was appropriate given what is happening currently with the House of Windsor. So he's trying to predict here, or he's trying to forecast what is going to happen and what the temperature will be. The thing is that these forecasts are based on models. And these models have become very sophisticated since we started collecting data in the 1890s. But we've recently had a number of experiences where the model broke down. The first one was actually when the El Nino explosion happened and where the El Nino volcano changed the entire weather pattern in the whole of the southern hemisphere. Droughts occurred at a moment where they shouldn't have, and basically we found out that the model did not allow for this to happen. And actually it happened again a second time last year with the so-called polar vortex from in the United States, where all of a sudden cold air came down straight from the North Pole in a fashion that happens maybe once every 100 years, and it wasn't part with the model, and they couldn't predict how cold it was going to be. So forecasting has a most definite function, but the further out that you try to forecast, the more difficult it actually becomes. Macroeconomic forecasting works very well for 5 years out, but after 10 years or 15 years, the question will be how reliable is the forecast? The same way as a weather forecast is good for tomorrow, maybe good for the end of this week, but it will not be able to predict the weather in December 2020. So, and then there is the foresight. Which is a different engagement. Here you see the child engaging with robotics. How do we engage with robotics? Do we fully understand what robotics mean? One more click, please. Do we really know what that means? Foresight has to, by nature, be a more participatory process. It's a participatory process in the sense that it does combine everything that we have. Called the crystal ball human intuition. What do we know as human beings about the society that we live in? Prediction, which is based on everything that we know as professionals, as people who have been looking at our society, who have been analyzing our society, who have been working to give shape to new things, as well as forecasting the data and the trends that we have, and bring that together into a different kind of debating environment that will allow us to look at the possible. So forecasting is a very valid process, and it's something that many countries have done, and that definitely we ourselves as the United Nations highly recommend around macroeconomics, but also around forecasting for climate change, in order to be able to develop methods that allow us to more or less see what is straight in front of us and see how these trends will develop, so that that can actually inform our thinking. Again, at this moment, the models on climate change have not yet sufficiently been developed, so we can't really yet pinpoint exactly how much sea level rise will be. We can't necessarily pinpoint how much the rise in temperature will be. And you will always hear at the international debates that a spectrum of options is being given. And whenever you hear one of those spectrum of options being given, you basically hear good foresight at work. That tells you it's going to be between 180 million people and 330 million people. That is what foresight essentially does. So that's what forecasting does. Foresight, one back please. Foresight, therefore, is systematic. It's not a crystal ball once off. It is participatory. It tries to gather information about the future and tries to build medium to long-term visions to basically allow the information to impact on current day decision making. Everybody has heard the story of a journey starts with taking the first step. Actually, I thoroughly disagree with that statement. A journey starts with determining that you want to go somewhere. And what is the process of actually setting that destination? How do you actually examine what is possible, what is feasible, and how can you anticipate different ways of getting there? That's what foresight is all about. And that means that when you look at in foresight, you actually start examining a very broad spectrum of futures. And the further out that you go, so if you say we're looking at the future by 2100, 100 years from now, already you see that there's a broader spectrum than when you keep it to the next 30 years or even the next 20 years. The first thing is that you have to examine the preposterous, the impossible, the thing that will never happen. But actually, for those of you who are fans of Star Trek, I'm a big fan of Star Trek myself, Star Trek predicted these things. In the 1960s, there was a telephone show with the very famous line, "Beam me up, Scotty." And it was done through a personal communication device that was shown on television. And what you actually can see, that sometimes the preposterous will happen. We are not yet, just for those of you know, we haven't made any progress on teleportation, which really would make my life a lot easier, I can tell you. Then you start to take a look from the preposterous at what is possible, what is likely, what is actually something that makes sense, right? Sometimes the predictions is so far out there that it stops making sense to anticipate a sea level rise of 1.5 meters by the year 2100 really does not make much sense, because that is such a far out there scenario that it really doesn't work. So you need to try and get back to things that you consider to be possible. And then after that, you take a look at what you consider to be plausible. Is this actually something that, given our history, given our understanding, is likely to happen? How would our society react to these kind of factors, and what do we actually believe that we can do? And then from there, you can start projecting the future, basically creating a baseline scenario of what we think most likely will happen. This will change. In no country in the world is that idea about what likely will happen the same from one year to the other. What is likely to happen will constantly shift because it's dependent also on external factors. For Egypt, for instance, what will play an enormous role is regional peace. Peace in the Middle East, but also peace in Africa, because peace in Africa will determine how much market access the country is going to get. These are not factors that we control. These are not factors that will remain stable, and things will change. And that finally then gets us into the probable and finally the preferable. The preferable is a very important phenomenon here, where you actually do have to make, to an extent, a value judgment about what should happen. What would we consider to be acceptable? And it's that what we would consider to be acceptable, what we would consider to be a good outcome. All people in Egypt living a life of prosperity, well-being, and dignity. That then can give rise to backcasting processes, setting targets, and trying to see what you need to do in order to get there. Next slide, please. Now, exploring the future is not something new, and I'm just here showing you a website that you can actually go and find. This is a website that our colleagues from Malaysia, I'm very sure, will be talking about. And this website shows their internal oversight, their internal foresight discussions on Industry 4.0 and what does it mean for the country and how would you look at adopting Industry 4.0. What is very important is that many countries are dealing with foresight processes very publicly and very openly. They are part of the national dialogue, they are part of the political process, so that people actually fairly consistently know where the country is moving to and how the country wants to evolve things. So we do want to indicate to you that the processes that we are talking about have been practiced by many other countries and were originally developed in many parts of academia and in major corporations. A corporation like Shell, I'm a Shell son, so I can tell you I was in the dining room listening to my father when these processes were first introduced in that organization. They have made it a successful global corporation by being able to anticipate shifting demands and shifting geopolitics. So many actors are out there practicing foresight, and I'm sure that will not be misunderstood when I say that I really think this is something that Egypt can actually benefit from by basically resuming practices that already existed in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. What was the approach that we took? Well, we decidedly were future-oriented. As I said, we were not lingering in the past nor in the present, because the present has a habit of actually becoming dictating what it is that you can think about. We deliberately took a step away from the daily reality of Cairo, engaged with the Bibliotheca Alexandria, moved ourselves out of the way in order to create a space to look at issues in a very creative manner. Secondly, we captured complexity. That meant that we never talked about one sector, Industry 4.0. We talked about the nature of mobility in the future. And in every situation, we brought together people from very, very different forces within society, from academia, from within politics, as well as from industry, wherever we could find people, who then would basically come up with a way of dealing with the complexity, because you had a lot of synergies and a lot of agreement about different factors that otherwise we wouldn't have gotten to. We also used very effectively taking the perspective of a real person. If we decided at a certain moment to build a scenario about a new, modern, smart city, we actually closed every session down with talking about how does a person live in that city? How does that actually impact the real reality of a human being? So that we did not necessarily get into too much academic debate, but that we tried as much as we could to ground it back to people. We were open-minded, opportunistic, and opportunity-focused. This was very important, because I would like to reiterate what I said during the opening statement. It's very easy to imagine the worst, but we very deliberately want to imagine the best. We did have in every situation a worst case scenario, but we never stuck too long with the worst case scenario. It was something that we wanted us to be informed by, but not something that we wanted to have driving the discussion. We were basically trying to see the future and try to fathom or try to think through what it would take in order to create that future. Next slide, please. So, how did we do the processes? What was it? We started off in all cases with horizon scanning. We presented some of the trend analysis, some of the key issues, sometimes drawing on issues that were playing in Egypt specifically, but also sometimes looking simply at global trends. We then drafted what we call the futures tree. A futures tree allowed us to find a way to actually connect the different issues and to basically also find out what the trunk of the tree was. And the trunk of the tree was quite often the mainstream of trends that we saw that came out. On the basis of the tree, we then started imagining a scenario. I gave you an example of a scenario in my opening speech about Egypt with 180 million people living in the year 2100. But there were many different ones that we developed. There were scenarios that we developed around education. There were scenarios that we developed around, or that young people actually developed around a DNA-specific designed medication, whereby medication is no longer something that you get from the pharmacy. It's actually medication that is 3D printed specifically for your DNA, for your particular health condition. So there were many, many ideas that floated around. My personal favorite was the scenario of the floating solar panels on Lake Nasser. Floating solar panels on Lake Nasser because that creates renewable energy, but it also stops the evaporation of Lake Nasser and therefore immediately helps the availability of water. Many, many of these ideas came forward. And then we had the utilization of wildcards. Now, wildcards were really important because sometimes those allowed us to test. When we were talking about the smart cities, my favorite wildcard, I was allowed to play my favorite wildcard. So I walked into the room and I said, well, you've just designed a smart city. I have unfortunate news. Cyber warfare between Russia and China has broken out and they broke the internet. What do we do now? And immediately the realization set in that if the internet is broken, there are so many processes that we were basically doing on the basis of internet functionality, payment systems, transportation systems, and all of these would stop functioning. And therefore, that actually it was really important that public stewardship and public administration would take care of these kind of vulnerabilities so that by adopting the Internet of Everything, we were not going to create a country that can actually be vulnerable to these kind of factors. That vulnerability profile came out in a number of situations, and it was really important to look. And then finally, as I said, we closed it down wherever we could, and sometimes the discussion was so engaged that we didn't get to the end of it, with immersive stories. Take the life in a person. How does the life of that person look? The one, again, my favorite, where there was the lady who was every morning doing the first 3 hours of her work on an interactive exercise bike. That was not only giving her the news, but also allowed her to send emails while she was basically exercising and at the same time ordering all the shopping for the evening meal. She was, by the way, not just working in Egypt, she was actually in her exercise bike working for a company in Belgium that could not work without her particular technical input. Many, many ideas floated. The way that we wanted to present it here, and let me just take a look a little bit at the conference, is to actually ask the people who were in the conference to share with you the ideas. That would allow many people to look across the ideas that came out, to see the visions that are there, and would allow us then to collectively have a discussion, particularly with international inputs, about what it would take for Egypt to make a sustained commitment towards managing the future in a better way. Let me stop here, and then I think I hand over to Professor Ibrahim Awad.
Thank you very much, Richard, and I'd like to first start by thanking the Biblioteca Alexandrina for kindly inviting me to this closing session. No, it's fine. To this closing session of the Alexandria Dialogue. I have enjoyed participating in dialogue in Cairo and Alexandria. I'd also like very much to thank my colleagues of the UN system, UN country team, and particularly Richard Dictus, the graduate coordinator, We've come to be good friends, and so thank you for inviting me, and thank you for inviting me to be the discussant in this first session. The program says critical discussion, and this morning the first thing that Richard said to me was, be critical, be critical. So I said, I'll be critical of you. He did not have any objection to that. So let me start by referring to a discussion, in fact, I had with a good friend, many of you here know, 10 days ago, about whether we can look down 30 years from now. With the pace of scientific and technological change, is it possible to really look down more than 10 years? What is, in this case, the realism? How realistic is it to project our views around the future if it ignores, it does not take account, and justifiably so, of what may come scientifically or technologically? You asked yourself and asked the audience whether anyone could have predicted in 1960 how Egypt would be in 2020. Would have anyone in the world predicted how the world would be in 2021 in 1950? Would have anyone predicted internet, email, Skype, FaceTime, the shortening of distance and time? Would have anyone predicted that? So it's not only about Egypt, and it's not only about expressing our wishes, and I will come back to that. My second observation is about to which extent can you work on the future of any country, not Egypt, any country, without situating it in the global economy, without situating it in the global system. Will we have a more open global system in 2050, or will the very sorry evolution towards nationalism that we're witnessing in different parts of the world, different regions, including the most advanced regions, will it affect the evolution of this global system? I think we need to situate, because more and more the economies are integrated in a global economy. In industrialized countries and in developing countries, you have economies that are integrated in a global economy. At the same time, you have very national and local economies which cannot keep pace with the integrated economy. This is my second observation, and related to it, of course, is you said, and I think rightly so, that Egypt should look at the Middle East, Arab world, to Africa for the future. But in fact, Middle East and Arab and Africa for the future, I would talk about them in a horizon of 10 years, because we don't really know 30 years from now whether geography will have the same value as it has today. In our world, next door to us, there is Israel, which in fact ignores geography and has developed beyond geography. So will geography be the main determinant of evolution or not? I, for one, think that Africa is extremely important for us, not for us, because we are Africa, I think we should develop ourselves within our continent. This is for sure. However, to which extent exchange and relations will be regionalized as opposed to globalized and universalized. Of course, you mentioned a cyber war between the United States and China, for instance. This, Europe is today affected by the trade war between the United States and China. So imagine the small countries, how would they be affected by such a possible war? Now, you have mentioned, Richard, four approaches to studying the future: the crystal ball, the prediction, the forecast, which is more scientific, and then the foresight. And the foresight, because I read your presentation, I received your presentation, foresight, which is based on forecast, in fact. But in reality, when we look at the scenarios in the document that I saw, I see no forecast. I see no forecast on which the foresight is based. So in fact, we are left with extremely delightful reading about a very bright future for Egypt in 2050, and yet we don't know how we will have achieved that. So in reality, I don't see how these scenarios have been constructed. It's fantastic. It's really delightful, and this is the future that I would hope for my country, of course, but how will we get there? On which basis do we say that? On which basis do we say that when we see that years of schooling are being in retreat in Egypt? It's not that they are increasing, it's not that they are even maintaining the level, they are being reduced. So how will we get there? This fantastic vision. I think this is really my main issue. And policies. I understand that this is not about planning. I understand this about, even though I would think that it would be useful to see how this 2050 connects with the Egypt Vision 2030. Is there any bridge between both or not? Again, I understand that this is not about planning. However, 2030 from 2050, 20 years, after it's nothing really in time, especially with the pace of technological change. So it's good to have this bright image. However, we should be also more down to earth and more realistic, because otherwise we'll fall in a pitfall of wishful thinking. No, we need to ground our foresight. 30 years, 2050, 30 years is not a very long time, and yet it is a very long duration for the pace of change that we're witnessing. And then I have some more specific issues. I think I dealt with the methodology as well as I could, but I have some specific issues in the summary in particular that I mentioned and that are related to what I have just said. For instance, it is said that Egypt should adopt an open, globalized labor market. I really don't understand what Egypt adopts an open global. At most, it can adopt its own labor market, it can open its own labor market, but how can it adopt an open, globalized labor market? And the irony is that 2 pages earlier in the summary, it is said that Egypt is threatened with mass migration from Africa. First, I don't think that migration threatens anyone. Migration is enriching. But how can we call for an open labor market and at the same time lament what could happen if the labor market were open? Again, I emphasize that migration is enriching, and we should keep from securitizing international migration. Another issue that I pick here, and there are many issues, and of course I'm not an expert on many of these issues. Egypt should not talk. There should not be talk about brain drain, because with an open a policy open to international mobility, countries win, countries add. And this is true, by the way. It's true, and we have examples of India. However, there is also agreement that beyond a certain share of the highly educated, this certainly becomes brain drain, and brain drain which negatively affects development. And I would understand such a call if there were a similar call for free mobility of low-skilled labor, and not only for the highly skilled. If this affected also the low-skilled Egyptian labor who could travel and acquire skills, that would be beneficial for Egyptian development. And this, again, brings up the question of the interrelatedness of issues and of Egypt's place in, not only Egypt, by the way, Egypt, Thailand, Argentina, places in the global economy. You cannot address the future in isolation of what will happen in the future. There is in the summary good references about the problems affecting Europe, and this is very important. It's very important because Europe is our first partner, after all, and we're in Alexandria, the first city that relates Egypt to Europe. So there is this mention, but we need to see how all of this will develop. And then the reference to public management. First reference to public management, management of the public sector, which should emulate the management of the private sector. I think that these are two sectors with different functions. They do not have the same functions, and therefore they cannot have the same approach to management. You know, many years ago, of course, but Julius Nyerere said in a meeting of the United Nations that it's good to be effective, it's good to be efficient. However, the United Nations is not a business, and we cannot measure effectiveness and efficiency in public international sector or in private international sector, private public sector, the same way, in the same approach. We measure effectiveness and efficiency in the private sector. I know that this is not confined to the exercise. I know that there's a very large debate about that. But we also see how the transposition of private sector approaches to public sectors, how they have resulted in what we see this month, last month, and the month before in many continents and many countries in the world. We have seen this in Lebanon, we have seen this in Chile, we have seen this in Ecuador, we have seen it in Bolivia, not in Bolivia for different reasons. We have seen this in France. So I think that looking down the future, I think we should also reconsider our approach to the relationship between public and private sector because all experiences of successful development have shown us that a role for the public sector, a role of the state is fundamental. All countries that have succeeded in pushing their development forward have had a very important role for the state. Finally, I'm glad, of course. Let me just I cannot keep from making the observation about international migration that more people than ever were living in countries other than their countries of birth in 2018. This is, of course, you will read it in the press here and there. However, this is not really true. The same percentage of people living in countries other than their countries of birth at the beginning of the 20th century was 3%, and 21st century is also 3%, and to be fair, 3.1%. So in fact, this is also a very widespread, and it goes in the discourse also of bashing the movement of people. But let me finish with an observation about identity. I think if the audience reads the summary, very interesting summary, you will see references time and again to the necessity of preserving the identity of Egypt and the identity of Egyptians, and this is very good. However, identity is not fixed. Exactly as you said, that in 1960, no one could have predicted Egypt in 2020. An Alexandrian of 1960 is not an Alexandrian of 2020. An Egyptian of the year 1800 is not the Egyptian of the year 2020. And this is sometimes good, sometimes probably not so good. And it's only by accepting change that we will advance. Certainly, diversity is important. We should keep the world diverse. Egyptians should not be like the French. The French should not be like the Czechs. The Czechs should not be like the Thai. However, neither of these have had a fixed identity. We should accept the evolution of our identity for the sake of building also not only an advanced and prosperous Egypt, but also a prosperous and peaceful world in which we all live, all peoples of all countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dictus and Professor Awad, for this enriching session. We are like 10 minutes ahead of our schedule. I don't know, Richard, do you care for some interventions, or we just move on for we have a group photo outside and a coffee break, and then we'll be returning for our first session of Alexandria Dialogues Round 1, chaired by Professor Hind Hanafi. Thank you all.